At almost 10 million square kilometers, Canada is the world's second largest country, but climate and terrain conspire to render most of its territory inhospitable. As a result, most Canadians are clustered in a long, narrow band along the southern border. The geography in the south allows for the support of large population centers, but in the case of Canada, this population is spread unevenly from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Managing a society across such a vast distance is not easy. Every region has its own set of political and economic needs. The fact that Canada has maintained its unity up until now is an achievement on its own. So let's talk about the true north, the ins and outs of Canadian geopolitics. I'm your host Shirvan and welcome to Caspian Report. Today's episode is sponsored by Trends, which is a community for entrepreneurs, investors, and ambitious people to gather and collaborate. I've been using Trends to network with others, with people in the geopolitical economic field of study, but also beyond. In particular, it has helped me to establish ties with other entrepreneurs in growing CaspianReport as a viable platform. Trends is all about jumpstarting ideas. It has thousands of insiders, investors, startup CEOs, exactly what you need to grow your business. And it's the ultimate knowledge hub from the hustle. With a subscription to Trends, you'll gain access to that community of industry leaders. Right now, you can get your first 7 days for just $1. Just go to trends.co/CaspianReport to get started. Tucked away in North America, Canada is insulated from threats emanating from other continents, with the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans making up the first line of defense. What shapes Canadian geopolitics more than anything else are its geographic features within. You see, about 80% of the country's landmass consists of inhospitable semi-Arctic terrain. People can still live in such environments, but not in large communities. That explains why most of Canada's 37 million citizens live by either the coastlines or by the long narrow band stretching along the US border. This band, which is roughly 160 kilometers in depth and about 7,000 kilometers in length, is one of the most decisive characteristics of the country. For all intents and purposes, it is the real shape of Canada. But being neighbors to a superpower is not for the faint-hearted. Described by Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau as sleeping next to an elephant, Washington's influence is often intensely felt across Canadian politics. Fortunately, Ottawa and Washington have been on good terms since 1815, and the economic ties reflect that relationship. Most of the United States relies on Canada as its leading export destination, while Canadian industries consider America their largest trading partner. This deeply integrated relationship is key to understanding the existing strategic frameworks. Canada's interdependent economic affair with America is rooted at the local level, which deters Washington from dictating unfriendly terms, because doing so would directly affect the well-being of American states at the local level and then affect the electoral outcome. Nobody wants this. As a result, the Americans have grown disinterested in Canadian affairs. Having said that, Washington's indifference towards its northern neighbor extends only as far as Canada isn't a security threat. A stable, unified Canada is predictable and admissible to influencing, two factors critical to Washington's interests. So the Americans will stay out of Canadian affairs as long as the latter presents no threat to the former. East of the population band along the US border is the St. Lawrence River, which streams westward from the Great Lakes into the Atlantic Ocean. This fertile patch of land is known as the Laurentian Corridor. It forms the heartland of Canada. Here, the population density is the highest, and the corridor includes major urban centers such as Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal, and Quebec. More than 60% of Canada's population and GDP is situated in the Laurentian Corridor, but not all is well in the heartland. The two components of the Laurentian Corridor, Ontario and Quebec, are as bitterly divided on cultural identity as they are estranged from their countrymen elsewhere. An uneasy power-sharing agreement exists between the two. Referred to many as the Laurentian Consensus, the deal between Ontario and Quebec has steered Canadian politics for most of its history. So, if the Laurentian Corridor is the beating heart of Canada, then it is a heart nonetheless suffering from ventricular dyssynchrony. That is to say, the two components are out of sync. The reason for this unusual arrangement are historical. When European powers rushed to establish footholds in the Americas, France and Britain eyed the fertile riparian plains of the St. Lawrence River. As British and French settlers established colonies, two different societies developed. One Anglophone and based in English liberal tradition, the other Francophone and based in Catholic paternalism. Over time, conquest and confederation brought Quebec into union with Ontario, but it remained an uneasy union nonetheless. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, Quebec repeatedly rebelled against the federal government in Ottawa, and those tensions remained alive and well into the late 1970s when radical Francophone secessionists threatened to break the statehood of Canada. When eventually the dust settled, a new compromise was reached. Henceforth, Ottawa would buy the loyalty of Quebec through the protection of Francophone cultural rights and by subsidizing the Quebec economy and the welfare state. The formula achieved mixed results. It pacified the Quebec independence movement, but the special treatment of Quebec seriously upset the other provinces of Canada. Thus, the Laurentian Consensus preserved Canada's territorial integrity, but at the cost of disassociating its faraway regions and possibly planting the seeds of future secessionist movements. One place where the sting of the Laurentian Consensus is acutely felt is West Canada. Home to 25% of Canada's population and generating 30% of its GDP, the western provinces are rapidly replacing the Laurentian Corridor in relevance. Whereas 10 years ago, 60% of all newcomers to Canada settled in Ontario, the growth of Pacific-oriented trade and Alberta's oil sands have changed the game. Nowadays, only 40% of immigrants settle in Ontario, and the booming population of the western provinces means that by 2050, West Canada is expected to achieve parity with East Canada in terms of population. With that parity, Canada's internal dynamics will shift accordingly. However, despite the growing demographics, West Canada can also be divided into components, much like the division in the Laurentian Corridor. Here, the rivalry focuses on the province of British Columbia and the Prairie provinces. The two could not be more different. The prairie towns are fiercely Anglophone and independent, they have long prospered in drilling and mining, and they have more in common with their American counterparts to the south than they do with their countrymen by the Pacific. In the prairie provinces, the disdain for the cosmopolitanism of Vancouver and Ottawa is palpable. So too is the discontent with the Laurentian Consensus. In particular, Alberta feels cheated by Quebec's special treatment, and the idea of separatism has been floating for some time. Meanwhile, for British Columbia, the focus is on Pacific-oriented trade and the growing markets in East Asia. As China's economy has grown over the decades, the importance of Canada's Pacific coast has grown just as much. Severed from the prairie provinces by the impassable Rocky Mountains, the coastal population centers of British Columbia have developed a cosmopolitan culture quite unlike the frontiersman spirit of the prairie. Taken together, many Canadian regions, be it Quebec, Ottawa, Alberta, or Vancouver, look at the world in very different ways. This peculiar geography has shaped the country into a confederation rather than the federation it claims to be. Each province holds more effective authority than the federal government. That said, in spite of the popular sentiment, secessionism is unlikely for the foreseeable future. Canada's division in population would be a problem by itself, but it is exacerbated by a geological phenomenon known as the Canadian Shield. Stretching from the Great Lakes to the north by the Arctic Ocean, the Canadian Shield is formed mainly of volcanic rock covered with a thin layer of soil. The topsoil is filled with swamps, rocky outcrops, and boreal forests, making agriculture nearly impossible. Plus, since the Canadian Shield covers over half the country, east-west transportation across Canada is impaired as well. Most rivers that snake through the Canadian Shield are shallow and unnavigable for commercial purposes, while the waterways that are navigable are subject to freezing 6 months of the year. As the southern tip of the Canadian Shield extends through the Ontario province, Canada is effectively cleaved in two. The distribution of population reflects that reality. Northern Ontario appears as a desolate wilderness dividing the country in two. This then explains Canada's division. The split between West and East Canada is not merely rooted in popular opinion, but cemented by the forces of nature. The Canadian Shield, therefore, is the source of Canada's geopolitical agony. Further north is Canada's Arctic region, a place that is neglected, isolated, and depopulated. That situation, however, is not to last for one reason: climate change. As the ice melts, new maritime and terrestrial areas are opening, presenting new passages and resources to exploit. The scramble for control over these emerging areas has already begun, but Canada does not have the numbers to fully utilize, secure, or even compete with the other Arctic nations. It also lacks a naval fleet capable of forwarding Canadian interests on the ground and the sea. Simply put, Canada lacks the capacity for an independent Arctic policy. What it can do instead is tap into the assets of its southern neighbor and find a way to make America act on behalf of Canada in the Arctic region and ocean. This American insurance policy would legitimize Canada's Arctic claims. However, before Ottawa can achieve its Arctic goals, it needs to establish peace at home. Today, Canada is undergoing significant change, and as with all change, growing pains are expected. The Laurentian consensus with Quebec is proving to be unsustainable, West Canada is gaining population parity, and the Arctic is opening new opportunities and vulnerabilities. On top of everything, Canada aims to reach a population of 100 million by 2100, which could affect its cultural identity and instill a political crisis. Eventually, in the coming decades, political power will shift away from the capital. Keeping track of all these fundamental changes will be difficult. Ottawa must find new ways to balance the constituent parts of the Confederation. Quebec seems to hold the key. Buying the loyalty of Quebec will lose viability in the long run, as West Canada will increasingly pay a greater portion of the bill. So Ottawa must either find other means of funding or ditch the whole arrangement and discover new ways of securing Quebec's loyalty. Having booked stability in East Canada, Ottawa must then find ways to bridge the socio-economic gap between British Columbia and the Prairie provinces. Taken together, Ottawa has a difficult century ahead. In other places, such internal frictions have torn countries and nations apart. And although Canada has beaten the odds before, it is difficult to imagine any form of unity beyond confederation. I've been your host Shirvan from Caspian Report. If you like what we do, please leave a like, comment and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and Saul.